Happy 2025, everyone. I wanted to start this year the same way I started last year, talking about Persona 3 Reload. That video was basically me just talking about my hopes for the game, being a remake to a huge game in Atlus's history, and it was mainly focused on the story. But today, I'm going to talk about Persona 3 Reload as a whole. Now, as I'm sure you can tell by the thumbnail, I wasn't a huge fan of Persona 3 Reload, but to all you hate watchers out there, let me briefly explain. I by no means think this game is a bad game, it's filled with quality. However, I did have hopes and expectations that weren't necessarily met, and to those who might say that I have high expectations of it, well, I feel like that is a reasonable thing to have for a series like Persona that constantly pumps out high quality stuff. In this video, we are going to go over a few things. First, we're going to address the gameplay of Persona 3 Reload. Then, we'll address the new content added to the game. And finally, we'll go over the specific story points that I wanted improved from my video before. I'm going to make this part quick, but of course, if you do like the content or you want to see more Persona or Atlus related content, please subscribe and give the video a like. It really does help out a lot. And I hope if you do disagree with me on these points, you'll at least hear me out. My opinion of the game should not infringe on your enjoyment or what you think is special about the game. And I hope if you do disagree with me that you'll leave it in the comments in a way that is to enlighten me on how I'm wrong instead of tearing me down and disregarding what I have to say. But without further ado, let's talk about the gameplay of Persona 3 Reload. The gameplay of Persona 3 Reload is probably where I'm going to be the harshest on the game. I would even argue that the gameplay is the main reason why I wanted to make this video. When I beat Persona 3 Reload, I didn't really think anything of it. However, later in the year, when Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance and Metaphor ReFantazio came out, I identified this as a key problem that I had with the game. I'm personally not a huge fan of the combat of Reload. I find the turn icon system of Metaphor or SMT5 Vengeance to be much more engaging. If you aren't familiar, I can briefly explain what the turn icon system is. In a lot of turn-based RPGs, there is a speed stat that determines your turn order. So, for example, if Mitsuru is faster than Shinjiro, Mitsuru will go first. And the order plays out in the order of fastest to slowest, including you and your enemies. The only exception to this rule is using one mores, which either allow you to attack twice or hand off your attack to one of your party members. The turn icon system, however, works a little bit different. Both you and your opponent will typically have a turn icon for each member of each team. Some enemies change that, but that's typically the rule of thumb. Each action you take spends a turn icon with the exception of passing to the next person in line. What happens if you pass your turn or if you hit a weakness or crit someone, that turn icon will turn into a half turn icon. And a half turn icon is essentially an extra turn icon that cannot be used to get an additional turn. Metaphor and SMT's combat is completely surrounded around this idea, and it creates for interesting and unique move combos, as well as interesting combos that the enemy can do. I should also mention that repelling or dodging an attack can remove anywhere from 2 to all of your turn icons. This form of combat is much more engaging because it's all about resource management. How can you maximize your turn icons? And you really have to pay attention to the enemy's weaknesses or resistances or repels because you could just straight up lose your entire turn. Now, I know what you may be thinking. Isn't the one more system also a resource management system? You would be correct. However, I think the difference is there's no risk involved. And trust me, I'm not necessarily a harder is better kind of guy, but I don't think that risk involved necessarily makes the game any harder. I think it just makes it more engaging. Metaphor is actually an amazing example of this. Metaphor's gameplay is not by any means hard. However, I'm very engaged in the battles because of that turn icon system. In my opinion, if you're gonna have an easy combat system like Persona 3 Reload and have it pretty simple with no complications, you probably should make the game a little bit more difficult. I think the focus for Reload was all about presentation, which I do think they did very well. The theurgy attacks look very cool, the shift mechanic also looks very cool. However, when it comes to how fun those mechanics are, I don't really think they add much. The conditions that you have to meet to do a theurgy attack I think are pretty engaging, but a lot of the characters just do it naturally and don't really have to go out of their way to do anything special. For example, Yukari is a healer character, that's mainly what her role is. So to make the condition of her theurgy to heal doesn't really feel like she is going out of her way to get this special attack, she just kind of gets it. They obviously had a goal to make it at least a little bit better than the original by adding things like theurgy. However, it didn't really do much for me. But anyways, I think keeping the gameplay faithful to the original Persona 3 was a huge blow to the game, and I would have really liked to see it improved in Reload. Alright, I think we've talked about gameplay enough. Let's get into the new things that they added in Reload that were not in the original. Persona 3 Reload has a lot of quality of life changes and general ups to presentation, as I stated in the last segment. Honestly, it's hard to believe that the original Persona 3 didn't have shifting in the game. It's something I just associate with Persona combat nowadays. However, we just talked about combat, so I want to bring your attention to the other improvements Reload made. More specifically, Tartarus. This seemingly never-ending dungeon was probably one of the most annoying parts of the original. However, it is more manageable in P3R. A big problem with Tartarus is, it's very repetitive. The random floor generation just isn't random enough. P3R added more unique things like Twilight Fragments and Monad Doors to spice things up. And while they are a welcome addition, I don't think they change very much about this area of the game. The most interesting thing about the Monad Doors are actually the static Monad passages. They probably have some of the more unique boss fights in the game there, which I do appreciate. That is kind of where my praise for Tartarus starts and ends though. After the spectacle of what's new fades away, Tartarus feels almost as torturous as it always has. My almost in that last statement actually has more meaning to it. As I stated in the combat section, Tartarus feels even more pointless because of how easy engaging with it is. Some of these new mechanics I think would have just greatly improved the experience if they didn't ignore overhauling a majority of the enemies as well. Gameplay experience is a big push and pull. The more powerful you make the player, by giving them all these amazing and fun tools, the enemies should be able to keep up. These enemies from the early 2000s now have to deal with every party member having a free, no drawback nuke waiting in the wing, when they had nothing of their own added to them. Okay, sorry, I slipped in more combat talk there. Let's talk about some of the great things that were changed in P3R. Probably the best change that they made in Reload is social links. Fully voice-acted social links should be the standard from now on. It's tough going back to an older Persona game after witnessing this change in P3R. This is even something I wish that Metaphor had. I loved seeing some of my favorite social links like Akinari, Aigis, and many others in a new polished way, which really testifies how this game probably has the best presentation out of any Persona game. Linked episodes were also a very cool thing that they added. It was nice to learn about some of the characters more, especially ones that needed it pretty badly, like Shinjiro. We'll get into that. The final thing I really wanted to point out that I think is a huge win for Persona 3 Reload is it being available in so many more languages. This edition doesn't really affect me at all. However, more people having access to these games I think is a huge net positive. Alright, now it's time what you have all been waiting for. Who cares about gameplay? Realistically, what is most important to a majority of the Persona fans out there is the story. I mean, there's a whole meme that Persona fans don't even play their own games. They just watch it on YouTube. But not you, right? Read it in Weeb viewer? Surely you wouldn't have done this. No, you played the game. So you're just fine with getting into some of the niche topics that you would have missed if you just watched it on YouTube, right? Okay, enough trolling. We are going to specifically dissect what I wanted improved from the story of Persona 3. P3 by no means is a perfect story, but it is one with plenty of potential. The theming is likely the best part of the original, and that all stays the same. But if you remember from my crusty audio video from last year, you would know that my problems lie with 5 characters in the game. Those characters being Shinjiro, the members of Strega, Takaya, Jin, and Chidori, and Ikutsuki. When I made this video, we had reason to believe that all of these aspects were going to get some love. The trailers showed off the linked episodes mechanic and the new tasks that you can do around the dorms, like cooking and planting. Okay, awesome. That's a plus for Shinjiro. The trailers also showed that you meet up with Takaya on random nights to have linked episodes of his own? Wow, that's insane. We had no reason to think Ikutsuki would become more interesting with Reload, but with the attention some of the other weaker parts of the story were getting based on the trailers, I had hopes that he would as well. Now, fast forward to today. What did these actually achieve for us? Well, I have good news. Shinjiro is a much better character with the linked episode. The information that you obtain and the struggles you learn that he is going through add so much more context to his actions, and honestly, I couldn't be more happy with that aspect of the game. Shinjiro has always been my favorite Persona 3 character, and they did him so much justice. Great. What about Strega? What's really funny is in my original video, I just so happened to point out, in the trailer, it only ever shows you working with Takaya. Did I think this would be the case once you played the game? No. I thought you would work with all of them. I almost wish they never showed the Strega side story in the trailers, because this was a huge letdown for me. The Strega linked episodes don't really add anything to Strega themselves. It kind of just gives you an excuse to see Takaya a tiny bit more than before. You do get an interesting lore drop regarding the members of Strega, but in quite possibly the funniest turn of events, it really is just lore about Mitsuru and the Kirijo group. Before P3R, we already knew that the Strega members are the only surviving test subjects from the Kirijo group, a company that was investigating in Shadow and Persona research. The Kirijo group picked up 100 orphans off the streets, and these 3 members of Strega were the only ones who survived the testing. In Reload, Takaya gives you a piece of paper to change your mind about how you think about the Dark Hour and Personas, as we are trying to eliminate them. The note he passes reads as follows. The new gear has eased summoning, but we need to make new safety cartridges before handing them off to MK. The evoker wait is also an urgent matter. Fortunately, ample test subjects remain to ... and that's where it ends. So, you're telling me that in the Strega side story, the only lore drop we get is this? I know they want to make anything new supplementary to the source material, but this aspect of the story I think really could have benefited from being even adjusted. It is just so unfortunate that Chidori is the only character that escapes this weird piece of plot that is Strega. I want to like Takaya and Jin more, but I feel like every time I see them, somehow I get more confused about their inclusion. And finally, the man with the plan, Ikutsuki. This character has always been my biggest criticism of this game. I just do not think he should exist. Ikutsuki's existence in the plot could arguably dilute other areas of the story as well. Before I get into that, let me explain why I believe they chose to make Ikutsuki in the first place. Ikutsuki's role in this story is to represent the old Kirijo group. This becomes very apparent when the events of November 4th take place. Ikutsuki and Takeharu, aka Mitsuru's dad, have a showdown, and before they end up exchanging bullets, they exchange words. These words would be them descrying if they side with Takeharu's father's initiation of the fall, essentially the end of the world. Ikutsuki does want this to happen, while Takeharu does not, and calls his father a fool. This completely makes sense why you would add a character that has this perspective, as it shows the change that has happened within the Kirijo group. However, I would make an argument that it would have been more interesting if Strega could take that place. Strega's entire ideals are about living in the moment, which they are very consistent with. However, I feel that if it was Takaya tricking you into killing the shadows, the motivation would check out. Using the research and technology of the group that tortured him to torture the world or even end it. Sure, a revenge plot is kind of a tried trope at this point, but what is there for Ikutsuki? He kind of just exists. The entire story, there's nothing really that hooks you to that character. So when the big reveal that he was just playing you all along happens, it feels like, oh, okay, he's a character stealing a spotlight that he never deserved. Another interesting point of this Strega hypothetical is how it actually plays into Takeharu's character. His entire character is about atoning for the past of the Kirijo group and taking responsibility for what his father did, and I just thought it would be really cool if he had to face that. A living, breathing representation of how terrible his father's company was. I am by no means saying that Strega filling that role is necessarily the correct answer either. I do feel that it is somewhat better than what we have, and that's a little disappointing considering I came up with it in 5 minutes while I was writing the script. I either want more reason to care about Ikutsuki the character, or I don't want him there at all. Persona 3 Reload is by no means a bad game, or a bad story. In fact, it's quite the opposite. I think it's a really solid RPG and a great introduction into the Persona series. The theming in any of the Persona 3 games is phenomenal, and despite my pretty harsh criticisms, I really do love a lot about these characters and this story. It's just as I said back in January 2024, Persona 3 Reload had the potential to be the best Persona game of all time. And I end that video by saying I even think it will. However, in my opinion, it just didn't hit that mark for me. And that actually makes me very sad because, as I said earlier, I love this story and these characters. But due to some gameplay issues and other aspects I was hoping would be shored up, it did fall short of my expectations. But what did you think about Persona 3 Reload? Let me know down in the comments, and again, if you like this video or like Persona content, please like the video and subscribe if you are interested in seeing more.